When we just focus on communication within organizations, based on that informational view of communication, we're taking what a colleague of mine at the University of Colorado calls a flat earth approach towards communication. What I mean by a flat earth approach is a perspective that seems correct from a limited vantage point because it works for much of our day-to-day lives, but ultimately it fails to account for the complexity of a situation. For much of human history, we got by just fine thinking that the earth was flat, even though it was always round. And even with our 21st century sophistication, where we know the earth is round, most of us can actually get by with flat earth assumptions much of the time. But what about when things get more complex? If you want to put a satellite into space or take a transcontinental flight, flat earth assumptions aren't going to be very helpful. Remember in elementary school when you compared a globe to a map and realized, for example, that it's much quicker to fly from New York to Moscow by flying over the North Pole instead of across the Atlantic? What seems counterintuitive from a flat Earth perspective actually makes perfect sense from a round Earth perspective. And the same is true with communication. We can get by with quote-unquote flat Earth assumptions about communication for much of what we want to do throughout our day. Much of our communication involves sending and receiving relatively unproblematic messages and acting on that information, giving directions, planning our schedules, requesting information, and so on. And the conventional informational approach towards communication works just fine in these situations. But other times things are a bit more complex. Like when you need to resolve conflict with a close friend or family member, or when you have to share bad news with someone you care about, confront someone about a wrongdoing, or you need to mediate a dispute. There's so much more going on in these situations than merely exchanging information. You are actually engaged in a complex process of meaning negotiation and social construction. In these situations, you have to do much more than think about what information you want to exchange. You actually have to think about the social realities you're creating. What might seem intuitive from a conventional flat earth approach to communication, like expressing what you think or trying to control information, may actually work against you because it constitutes a social reality that produces unfavorable outcomes. And this is especially true within the context of organizations. Sure, much of what goes on in organizations is the transmission of messages between senders and receivers. But what about implementing a large-scale organizational change, or navigating the politics of an organization, or persuading skeptical leaders about the merits of a new idea? If you've ever been involved in any of these activities, you know you quickly run up against some organizational complexities that make the mere transmission of information inadequate to successfully accomplishing your goals. Things like power, identity, gender, ideology or worldview, ethnicity, culture, and so forth are the quote-unquote round earth complexities of the organizational landscape that call for a much more sophisticated understanding of communication. And these complexities need to be accounted for if we are to have a good understanding of organizational communication. So this has to do with our approach to communication, either as a thing that happens within organizations or a social process that actually constitutes organizations and organizational realities, and our corresponding approach to organizations, either as relatively neutral containers that exist apart from communication, or as contested sites of power, resources, and strategies that converge into recognizable forms we call organizations.